While I wouldn't call Eternal Champions an important fighting game for the ages, part of me's always loved that you could choose a snake or a chicken to fight against a vampire, caveman, pirate, and even a money-grubbing politician. I'm a big fan of weird and comically over-the-top matchups in my fighting games, which is one of the reasons why the new Switch game Fight of Gods caught my attention. It's a one-on-one brawler where you pit some of religion's most revered deities against each other in a no-holds-barred battle royale. And yes, it's every bit as goofy as you would imagine. But does that make it the frontrunner for the best fighting game of 2019? Let's find out. Look, I'm gonna level with you. Fight of Gods probably won't be for everybody. If you're deeply religious and find the idea of Jesus punching Buddha to be wildly offensive, then I can appreciate where you're coming from and I don't blame you for tapping out. Personally, I'm not religious, so I take all of this in good fun. As far as I'm concerned, this is a silly novelty fighter starring a bunch of larger-than-life figures, all of which have the kinds of superpowers that would make this kind of game exciting. And it's not just Jesus punching Buddha, but also Zeus throwing thunderbolts, Anubis clawing his way to the top, Odin and his giant sword, Moses laying down some commandments, Freya coming from the Norse, and Athena, who looks like she just stepped out of the last Soul Calibur game. And if you're still confused about the tone of this game, the one and only Santa Claus shows up to deliver toys and take selfies with Sif, Mazu, and the rest of the star-studded cast. As a fighting game, Fight of Gods is pretty standard stuff. We get light, medium, and hard attacks, along with a throw button and the usual assortments of fireballs, uppercuts, and spinning attacks. This is a 2D fighting game that doesn't stray too far from the formula laid down in Street Fighter II and all kinds of other games of that era, complete with the typical quarter circle moves and the usual combos. And I don't say that as a negative, because I actually liked that I could jump in without needing to relearn a bunch of mechanics. This is a silly novelty fighting game where religious figures duke it out. There's no reason to make things more complicated than they need to be. To the game's credit, the developers have done a good job of making each fighter feel unique and powerful in a different way. There's a nice variety here, including fighters that use weapons, some that use their fists, and a bunch that use magic to win the fights. I also like that each character has a powerful special move that they can charge up, as well as the DPS gauge that'll enhance the fighter for a brief time. And I had no problem finding a few characters that I genuinely enjoyed playing with. The curse of the novelty fighting game is that once the novelty wears off, it still needs to be a fun fighting game. I think Fight of Gods fares better than most in that department. Unfortunately, there is quite a bit to criticize. While I loved tearing it up with Anubis and Moses, I found that a lot of the characters were a bit stiff. I hate to say it, but there were times when it reminded me a lot of the second and third tier fighters that came out in the mid-1990s. There isn't a lot of fluidity to the battles, often resulting in fights that come across as a bit wooden. Part of the problem is that there aren't enough moves to fill up the downtime, and the ones that are there aren't nearly as spectacular as what you would hope for. There were a lot of times where I was hoping the game would go bigger and more over the top, but it often felt like the developers were constrained by money. Sadly, the low-budget feel permeates throughout the entire game. There's almost no single-player content to be found here unless you count the bare-bones arcade mode. You also won't find a story, so don't expect to discover why Santa is suddenly pummeling Zeus. I mean, there is a story in the loosest sense of the word. We get a single-screen description of the flimsy setup, and then an ending that lasts no more than 20 seconds. And it's the same ending no matter who you beat the game with. Oh, and there are also misspellings. Of course, there were signs that maybe the ending would be terrible long before the credits rolled. After fighting through the entire roster of characters, you end up going against a final boss that is simply known as Boss. That's it, just Boss. He's not given a name, a character, or even a personality. It's almost as if he's just the stand-in until the real boss shows up. This is a game starring some of the biggest names in religions that date back thousands of years. So it's more than a little disappointing to see that there isn't a story and a cool boss that brings all this together. It feels like they came up with a cool idea first, but ended up running out of money before fully capitalizing on the killer premise. On a more positive note, I like a lot of the character designs here and some of the backgrounds. Like the rest of the game, the locations are a bit hit or miss, but there were a few that I always looked forward to fighting in. I especially liked the Garden of Eden, the mysterious North, and the Red Sea, which has been conveniently parted for this occasion. There's so much about the characters, designs, and locations that I like that it's disappointing that it often feels cheap. When the game is about Jesus fighting Santa Claus, I think it's safe to say that you know what you're getting. Fight of Gods is appropriately goofy, all while being a surprisingly solid fighting game with a cool cast of characters. Unfortunately, the fighters don't have nearly enough moves, the presentation sometimes feels cheap, the gameplay is stiff, there's no online mode, and the endings are laughably bad. On the other hand, the cheap asking price helps to mitigate some of those problems. If you like fighting games and think the concept is funny, then I doubt you're going to be disappointed with Fight of Gods. Hey, thanks for watching our review. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new reviews and features almost every day. Now here's the question I have for you. What's your guilty pleasure fighting game of choice? Look, the last 25 years have been littered with serious fighters, but I'm partial to a lot of the more comical ones. Like, if you played Brutal Paws of Fury, that's the fighting game with the animals. Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, I'm currently hard at work on a bunch of reviews, including Genesis Alpha 1, 8-Bit Horde, and more. If you ask me, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.